Let's talk about 1932. America was at a massive crossroads. The Great Depression had brought the entire nation to its knees. And that year's presidential election, well, it wasn't just about picking a leader. It was about choosing a path forward, choosing what kind of country America was going to be.
You know, to really get a feel for the mood in the country back then, you just have to listen to the music. This one line from the song Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? It became like the unofficial anthem for the Great Depression. It just perfectly captured that deep sense of betrayal that millions of people felt. People who had worked hard, who had literally built the country, and were now left with absolutely nothing.
In that song, it felt personal to so many people. But the crisis itself was national. The stock market crash back in 29 had kicked off this economic collapse that was honestly unlike anything the country had ever seen before.
The scale of the devastation was just staggering. I mean, we are talking about a quarter of the entire workforce being unemployed, factories just grinding to a halt, families losing their homes left and right. This wasn't some minor economic downturn, it was a total societal breakdown. And of course, that created the perfect storm for a really dramatic political showdown.
So, who was in the White House through all of this? President Herbert Hoover. He was a Republican, and he came into office with a very specific, very clear philosophy about what the government should and shouldn't do. It was a philosophy that had pretty much defined the Roaring '20s, that decade of prosperity right before the crash.
This quote here tells you everything you need to know about his core beliefs. And get this, he said it before the Depression even hit. For Hoover, having the government step in directly wasn't just a bad idea. He saw it as a threat to the very idea of American liberty. He was genuinely afraid it was a slippery slope to what he called state socialism, where the government ends up controlling everything.
And this philosophy had a name: rugged individualism. The whole idea was that America's strength came from self-reliance. You know, that pioneer spirit that people believed built the country. In Hoover's world, problems were best solved by you, your local community, and private charities, not by the federal government stepping in.
So what did that actually look like in practice, with millions of people starving? It looked like bread lines. Instead of the government providing direct aid, Hoover's whole approach relied on private groups and charities to provide relief. And as you could imagine, a lot of people felt that was just tragically, completely inadequate for a crisis of this size.
So the election of 1932 really boiled down to this fundamental choice. On one side, you have Hoover's vision: individual self-reliance, limited government. And on the other side, you have a challenger who's promising something completely different.
And that challenger was the Democratic governor from New York, a guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR. And he wasn't just offering a few different policies. No, he was offering a whole new vision for the relationship between the government and the American people.
Roosevelt framed the whole issue as a kind of social contract. He basically argued that if you have economic power, you also have a duty to the public. And if the people with power fail to live up to that trust, well, then the government doesn't just have a right to step in, it has a responsibility to step in on behalf of the people. This was the absolute core of his New Deal promise. Now, during the campaign, the specifics were a little vague, but the principles behind it, they were revolutionary for the time. Roosevelt was proposing that the government had a moral duty to protect its citizens' well-being, to act as a safety net when the private sector failed. This was a complete 100% rejection of Hoover's entire worldview.
So, with these two totally different paths laid out in front of them, the American people headed to the polls, and the decision they made would turn out to be one of the most decisive in the entire history of the country.
This number says it all. 472. That is the number of electoral votes that Franklin Roosevelt won. It was, and this is not an exaggeration, a political earthquake.
I mean, just look at this map. It is a sea of blue. This wasn't just a win. It was an absolute landslide. It was a powerful, coast-to-coast rejection of the old way of thinking and a crystal-clear mandate for bold, dramatic action.
And to really put that into perspective, look at the final count. Roosevelt got 472 electoral votes. Hoover got just 59. The American people hadn't just picked a new president, they had overwhelmingly, and I mean overwhelmingly, embraced a brand new philosophy of government.
The impact of this single election would echo for decades. It fundamentally changed the country and what Americans expected from their own government.
So if you take one thing away from this, let it be this. After 1932, the federal government's role in people's lives was permanently expanded.
The idea that Washington, D.C. had a direct responsibility for the economic well-being of regular citizens went from being a radical, fringe idea to just mainstream American policy.
This election also kicked off a massive political realignment. Roosevelt's promise of a New Deal created this whole new coalition. It brought working-class voters, farmers, and minority groups all into the Democratic Party. That shift would basically define American politics for the next 50 years, and, of course, it paved the way for all of his ambitious New Deal programs.
And all of this leaves us with a really fascinating question, doesn't it? Does a leader actually need a massive, landslide victory like this to make dramatic changes? Or can it be done with a much narrower win? It's a question about political power and public will that is just as relevant today as it was way back in 1932.